Something else that I think is kind of interesting that might be kind of a fun note to conclude on, unless you have more,
Mm-hmm.
is I guess there was a Catholic Answers Live event that happened. And one of the questions that popped up was, I heard it said that every fragment of a host retains the real presence of Christ, irrespective of size. This contradicts what was said on Catholic Answers Live. And so the individual that's doing the QA, I think his name is Jimmy Aiken, responded with, it is not accurate to say that every fragment of a consecrated host retains the real presence of Christ, irrespective of size. The traditional teaching, as I indicated, is that when the consecrated elements no longer have the appearance of bread and wine, the real presence ceases. For example, we'll go back over to our friend St. Thomas Aquinas. He states that when the body and blood of Christ succeed in the sacrament to the substance of the bread and wine, if there be such change on the part of the accidents, remember the color, taste, shape, etc.
Wetness. Oh, the accidents versus wetness.
Right.
Sorry.
As would not have sufficed for the corruption of the bread and wine, then the body and blood of Christ do not cease to be under the sacrament on account of such change, whether the change be on the part of the quality, as for instance when the color or the savor of the bread or wine is slightly modified, or on the part of the quantity, as when the bread or wine is divided into such parts as to keep in them the nature of bread or of wine. But if the change be so great that the substance of the bread or wine would have been corrupted, then Christ's body and blood do not remain under the sacrament. And thus, either on the part of the qualities, as when the color, savor, and other qualities of the bread and wine are so altered as to be incompatible with the nature of bread or of wine, or else on the part of the quantity, as, for instance, if the bread be reduced to fine particles, or the wine divided into such tiny drops that the species of bread or wine no longer remain. It's kind of interesting because if you, for example, go to receive communion and maybe you bite in a host and I guess a good example would be like a crumb, like escapes your mouth or something like that.
Yes.
I think that's what's being referenced here, where the real presence ceases.
I'm confused by that. I got lost. Why does the real presence still not exist?
Because the nature of the bread or wine have been corrupted. The bread being reduced to fine particles and the wine being reduced to tiny drops. It's like the nature of the whatness changes. In addition to the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith from 1972 states, after communion, the leftover hosts, as well as any particles that may have fallen from them, and that still have the form of bread, are to be reserved or consumed with the reverence due to the Eucharistic presence of Christ.
Yeah, like we watch if there's any tiny fragments left on the plates from where the Eucharist were sitting. We watch them be swept into like the chalice, and then the priest, if it's left over after everybody has received communion, then the priest will consume the rest. If there's a lot of the Eucharist left, then they put it back in the tabernacle for safety. So I'm not understanding, like those pieces are treated with such reverence. So I'm not understanding that in relation to the crumb. Is that where you're going?
Right. So if I continue on, I think it'll help answer the question.
Okay.
The Congregation, thus honors the traditional teaching by speaking of three things. So, one, the hosts, two, the particles of hosts that still have the form of bread, and three, other particles, i.e., those that are so small they no longer have the appearance of bread. The congregation indicates that 1 and 2, the hosts, particles of hosts that still have the form of bread.
Oh, like if you can see them with your eyes?
Maybe.
Okay.
Retain the real presence and so are to be reserved or consumed with the reverence due to the Eucharistic presence of Christ. Whereas 3, other particles, which could be particles that are so small they no longer have the appearance of bread, are to be taken care of with the prescriptions for purifying the chalice and paten. Per Aquinas, they no longer have the real presence, but because they used to have the real presence, they are to be disposed of with proper ceremony, being dissolved in water and then the water consumed. Or if it's the water used to wash a corporal, poured into a sacrarium.
I like that word.
So there may be particles left over in either the bowl or the chalice, and that's why they go like water. They use the holy water from like one to the other and almost like swirl it around to get any particles that may not be able to be seen by the naked eye.
Yes.
And I think that would fall into number 3 there. So
sounds like what you're saying is 1 and 2 is one thing and 3 is another thing.
yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. Because I think there's maybe even the chance that there might not be anything there.
Yes.
But you're purifying the objects that the body and blood were held in.
Okay.
Not make sense?
No, it makes sense. I think what wasn't making sense is that part that you were saying before all of that, where if it's a piece broken off of like the main Eucharist, it no longer has the parts. That's where I was getting lost.
I'm taking this a step further.
Okay.
The Summa Theologiae is what was being referenced at the bottom, and the reference was Article 4, whether the sacramental species can be corrupted. Objection 1. It seems that the sacramental species cannot be corrupted because corruption comes of the separation of the form from the matter. But the matter of the bread does not remain in the sacrament, as is clear from what was said above. Therefore, these species cannot be corrupted. Objection number 2. Further, no form is corrupted except accidentally. That is, when its subject is corrupted. Hence, self-subsisting forms are incorruptible, as is seen in spiritual substances. But the sacramental species are forms without a subject. Therefore, they cannot be corrupted. Objection number 3. Further, if they may be corrupted, it will be either by naturally or miraculously. But they cannot be corrupted naturally because no substance or subject of corruption can be assigned as remaining after the corruption has taken place. Neither can they be corrupted miraculously, because the miracles which occur in this sacrament take place in the virtue of the consecration, whereby the sacramental species are preserved. And the same thing is not the cause of preservation and of corruption. Therefore, in no way can the sacramental species be corrupted. On the contrary, we perceive by our senses that the consecrated hosts become putrefied and corrupted. I answer that corruption is movement from being into non-being. Now it has been stated that the sacramental species retain the same being as they had before when the substance of the bread was present. Consequently, as the being of those accidents could be corrupted with the substance of the bread and wine was present, so likewise they can be corrupted now that the substance has passed away. But such accidents could have been previously corrupted in two ways. In one way of themselves, and another way accidentally. They could be corrupted of themselves, as by alteration of the qualities, and increase or decrease of the quantity, not in the way in which increase or decrease is found only in animated bodies, such as the substances of the bread and wine are not, but by addition or division. For, as is said in Metaph 3, one dimension is dissolved by division, and two dimensions result. While on the contrary, by addition, two dimensions become one. And in this way, such accidents can be corrupted manifestly after consecration, because the dimensive quantity which remains can receive division and addition. And since it is the subject of sensible qualities as stated above, it can likewise be the subject of their alteration. For instance, if the color or the savor of the bread or wine be altered. An accident can be corrupted in another way through the corruption of its subject. And in that way also they can be corrupted after consecration. For although the subject does not remain, still the being which they had in the subject does remain, which being is proper and suited to the subject. And therefore such being can be corrupted by a contrary agent, as the substance of the bread or wine was subject to corruption, and moreover was not corrupted, except by a preceding alteration regarding the accidents. Nevertheless, a distinction must be made between each of the aforesaid corruptions, because when the body and the blood of Christ succeed in the sacrament to the substance of the bread and wine, if there be such change on the part of the accidents, as would not have sufficed for the corruption of the bread and wine, then the body and blood of Christ do not cease to be under the sacrament on account of such change. Whether the change be the part of the quality, as for the instance when the color or the savor of the bread or wine is slightly modified, or on the part of the quantity, as when the bread or the wine is divided into such parts as to keep them the nature of bread or of wine. But if the change be so great that the substance of the bread or wine have been corrupted, then Christ's body and blood do not remain under the sacrament, and thus either on the part of the qualities, as when the color, savor, and qualities of the bread and wine are so altered as to be incompatible with the nature of bread or of wine, or else on the part of the quantity, as for example, if the bread be reduced to fine particles, or the wine divided into such tiny drops that the species of bread or wine no longer remain. So, replies to the objections, and we'll cap off here.
I am so not a theologian, but I'm trying to absorb.
It makes sense. It's just you got to take a step back and like really take it in.
Play and replay what you're reading.
So, the reply to objection 1 is as follows. Objection 1 was, it seems that the sacramental species cannot be corrupted, because corruption comes of the separation of the form from the matter. But the matter of the bread does not remain in the sacrament, as is clear from what was said above. Therefore, the species of bread cannot be corrupted. The reply is as follows. Since it belongs essentially to corruption to take away the being of a thing, insofar as the being of some form is in matter, it results that by corruption, the form is separated from the matter. But if such being was not in matter, yet like such being as in matter, it could be taken away by corruption, even where there is no matter, as takes place in this sacrament, as is evident by what we just talked about. This is a reply for objection 2, which was no form is corrupted except accidentally. Although the sacramental species are forms not in matter, yet they have the being which they had in matter. And then finally, reply to objection number 3, which stated, further, if they are corrupted, it will either be naturally or miraculously. This corruption of species is not miraculous, but natural. Nevertheless, it presupposes that the miracle which is wrought in the consecration, namely that those sacramental species retain without a subject, that the same being as they had in a subject. Just as a blind man to whom sight is given miraculously sees naturally. Have I thoroughly confused you?
Yes. I have to be honest. I probably need to listen to that or read what you're reading from again and again.
I think the thing
Does
that
it
makes...
make sense to you immediately?
No, not immediately, but I think the bottom line is that you are looking at these. I think it's the thing that most people get stuck on,
Yes.
is that they are the body and blood of Christ, but what we see is bread and wine.
Yes.
And if you believe what we believe as Catholics, when the priest consecrates these two subjects, if you will, there is a miracle that occurs through transubstantiation where they become the body and blood of Christ. They don't represent the body and blood of Christ. They become the body and blood of Christ.
Correct.
So
I'm with you so far.
right. This article and what I read basically provides arguments and objections to how those things can be corrupted.
Yeah.
But it's like at what level? For example, the nature of bread or wine. When do they not become bread or wine anymore? Has the taste been altered? Has the shape been altered in some way that it doesn't represent what it originally was?
Yeah.
All of those things are corruptions, I guess, that this is speaking to here.
I think that it's kind of real that I'm taking it in and trying to understand it from my own perspective, because I've never had a objection to it. But that doesn't mean that other people wouldn't, and that other people wouldn't understand what you're trying to convey.
If you had a host, for example, and the host was consecrated and it wasn't consumed immediately, its natural form, if left to the air, would likely rot or grow mold or something.
Possibly, unless it's a Eucharistic miracle, but we're trying not to go
Right,
down that
but
road.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's just confusing. Don't go down there. I'm just saying, like, the natural form is what's being corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it is the body of Christ, what's being corrupted is the natural form, which is the bread.
Yes.
And at that moment, I think if it's corrupted, then it no longer is a vessel for body of Christ.
We think that's what it's saying?
I think that that's a piece of it, yes.
Okay.
You have to separate the natural part of whatever the thing is from the miracle or what happens during transubstantiation.
Yes. I get that. That part makes sense.
So, for example, if a consecrated host is, if the host itself begins to deteriorate or rot, we would consider that the physical or natural appearance of the bread is diminishing.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be addressed by dissolution in the water, right? So, like, the consecrated host could be dissolved in water until it no longer has the appearance of bread.
Yes.
Or pouring into a sacrarium in the ground. So once the host has dissolved in water, the water should then be poured into a sacrarium or onto the ground in a place where it won't be walked upon, such as in a garden or a bush. sacrarium is almost like a special sink in the sacristy that drains directly into the earth. Take it a step further. EWTN has an article by Father Edward McNamara, simply titled, "When a Host Isn't Swallowed." How should one dispose of a consecrated host which was placed in the mouth of an ill person who in the end was unable to swallow it?
Ooh.
In Canada, most parishes use several types of missal booklets for either English or French masses. Once these have expired, they are thrown out. The question is, since the majority of people now take communion in the hand instead of directly by the mouth, particles of the host are bound to become attached to these missals when the communicant returns to their pew. How then should these missals be disposed of? It just doesn't seem right. If they have particles of hosts on them, to throw them in the garbage does not seem correct. Could you please give us some advice on the subject? So 2 questions regarding the same thing. And the answer that he gives is, a host which has been partially consumed in some way may be disposed of by placing it in water until it has dissolved and then pouring the water into the sacrarium or into the ground. If the mishap has occurred outside of a parish, for example, in a nursing home or hospital with no chapel, then it should be carefully wrapped in a purificator and brought to the parish for proper disposal. Some courageous ministers might be willing to consume such a host themselves out of respect, but this is usually not advisable and is unnecessary.
Interesting. I would think that would be the answer.
Regarding the second question, I do not really think there is much danger of fragments of hosts remaining on the booklets. If such were the case, and they would also remain in other places such as pews, the clothes worn by the faithful, and all over the floor. If the church had considered that there was serious danger of fragments being deposited in various places as a result of the practice of receiving communion in the hand, then it would never have contemplated permitting the practice. This is, of course, presuming that the hosts used are properly produced and not subject to easy fragmentation. As dealt with in more detail on the follow-up published in July 5th, 2005, according to traditional Catholic theology, above all, at St. Thomas Aquinas, a microscopic fragment is no longer an integral part of the host, and may therefore be considered as equivalent to a corrupt host in which Christ's presence would no longer exist. Therefore, I believe that the booklets may be disposed of without scruple as regarding the possibility of the Eucharistic presence. They still contain God's word, however, and while strictly speaking they are not sacred objects like the missal or lectionary, many people have scruples about mixing these booklets with common trash.
Scruples.
While it is not necessary to go to great lengths to dispose them, if feasible, it may be better to take them directly to an incinerator or paper recycler rather than mixing them with common garbage. There's a follow-up in 2007. Some readers took umbrage toward the affirmation in our June 12th column that Christ's real presence would no longer subsist in a microscopic fragmentation of the host. So you're not alone in your thinking.
Just going to say, that's me.
Restating an essential point here from the same priest. My reply was principally based on an application of the doctrine of St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in the corpus of the 4th article of the question whether the sacramental species can be corrupted. Ready? So this is what we just went through a few minutes ago. An accident can be corrupted in another way through the corruption of its subject. And in this way also they can be corrupted after consecration, for although the subject does not remain, still the being which they had in the subject does remain, which being is proper and suited to the subject. And therefore such being can be corrupted by a contrary agent, as the substance of the bread or wine was subject to corruption, and moreover, was not corrupted except by a preceding alteration regarding the accidents. Nevertheless, a distinction must be made between each of the aforesaid corruptions, because when the body and blood of Christ succeed in the sacrament to the substance of the bread and wine, if there be such change on the part of the accidents as would not have sufficed for the corruption of the bread and wine, then the body and blood of Christ do not cease to be under the sacrament on account of such change, whether the change be made on the part of the quality, as for example, when the color or the savor of the bread or wine is slightly modified, or on the part of the quantity, as when the bread or the wine is divided into such parts as to keep in them the nature of bread or wine. But if the change be so great that the substance of the bread or wine have been corrupted, then Christ's body and blood do not remain under his sacrament. And this either on the part of the qualities, as when the color, savor, and other qualities of the bread and wine are so altered as to be incompatible with the nature of the bread or wine, or else on the part of the quantity, as for instance, if the bread has been reduced to fine particles, or the wine divided into such tiny droplets that the species of the bread or wine no longer remain. Thus, our discussion dealt specifically with the theme of the corruption of the host by reduction of fine particles, that the species of bread no longer remain. This is a different question to that of Christ being really present in small particles or fragments of a host while retaining the species of bread. So long as the species of bread remains, Christ is really present and is even possible to administer communion to the sick or persecuted using very small pieces of hosts or even drops of precious blood. Thus, while Christ would certainly not be present in microscopic or no longer visible fragments, it is almost impossible to establish a dividing line when dealing with small but visible particles, and the Church has never wished to pronounce on this theme. In part, this is due to the objective difficulty and danger in making such a demarcation, but also so as to avoid giving any justification whatsoever for a lackadaisical manner of treating the sacred species. Even when specifically asked about this question in the 60s, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith merely recalled the necessity of observing due reverence for all fragments by carefully following all church norms regarding the purification of sacred vessels and altar linens, as well as the proper procedure for cleansing the area if a host should happen to fall on the floor.
So I can still keep thinking tiny microscopic parts are still retaining both things.
It seems a little complicated.
And contradictory in some ways.
Do you have anything else?
I wanted to recommend anyone who hasn't seen it watch something called The Veil Removed, the film on YouTube. It's a little over 7 minutes long, and it gives a visual representation of what we believe as Catholics is happening during a Mass that we can't see. And it's part of that mystery that we've referenced. But it also gives a visual representation. I haven't even gotten to the hard word to pronounce, of transubstantiation. And I had never seen that video before. And when I was shown it, I was like, how have I not seen this before? I just thought it was a great visual for what we believe is happening behind the veil or behind the scenes, if you will. I think it's Corinthians, right? The so great a cloud of witnesses. Let us run the race that's before us.
Mm-hmm. I think that's what it is.
The visuals in that film kind of take my mind back to that, but it applies to our current conversation, I think. The things that you've referenced and I've referenced today.
A little bit to mull on there.
Just a little.
Just a little bit.
You really read us a lot there.
Yeah, my mouth hurts. That is my brain.
Take a rest on this cool weather day.
You too. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.